Well, hello, Endow ladies. It is my supreme pleasure to welcome Adam Young from the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. Did I get all that information correct,
You
Adam?
got it right. That's the podcast. It's
Well,
good to be here.
it's so good to have you here today, and I know our Endow women are going to just love you and love your podcast once they discover it, if they haven't already. But I recently discovered your podcast and your ministry through a friend of mine she's the kind of friend in my life who somehow always has the good stuff hidden away. And so she'll send me just the right book at the right time and just the right podcast at the right time. She's like, you're not going to believe this is like an incredible podcast, The Place We Find Ourselves, which of course I'll link up to this YouTube channel and podcast. But so of course, being the ENFP, sanguine, extroverted woman that I am, I of course blasted it out to everybody. And now we have all these conversations going surrounding so many of your episodes. So it is a supreme pleasure to have you today, Adam. And there's so much I want to talk to you about. And goodness, I've had my sister on the show, who is also a therapist and a Christian therapist, and a good friend of ours, Michelle Huntley, where we talked about addiction and sex addiction and porn addiction, all those kind of things. So there's so much that we can cover. And just in listening to your episodes, gosh, the things that our Endow women are dealing with, struggling with, wanting breakthroughs for. I mean, God, we could talk about so many things, but here's what's on my mind. Let's see where the conversation goes. I recently listened to, I think it's your latest episode on Judgment. And what was so liberating to me about that is that actually we are called to judge. And that's not a politically correct thing to say. That's not a safe thing to say. But actually, it's a biblical thing, is that we have to make judgments. Now, of course, there's disclaimers and qualifiers with that, but I think that might be something interesting to talk about. The other things that are on my mind is that, especially this year has been a very difficult year, a lot of anxiety, a lot of anger, so much tension. And I think that whether it's 2020, whether it's COVID or not, it seems to me that the emotional obstacles that really get in the way of kind of a blossoming of faith and freedom is anger and anxiety. I would say maybe those, you're the therapist, not me, but it seems to me that those are the kind of two things that like we have to go to battle with in spiritual warfare. The other thing that I thought might be interesting is that, oftentimes I say this again and again, that the Christian faith is an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ and a dynamic relationship with him. But it's very easy to fall into two reductions of the faith. One being an ideology, that we just slap Jesus on like a bumper sticker to our lives and call it Christian. Or reduced to an ethical system or a moral code, which of course we have that, but that's not the essence of the faith. Or sentimentality, just, like a country club of good feelings, or, just this nostalgia for Christian things, but not the real uncomfortable dynamic relationship with God. So in light of that, I thought maybe we could talk about the obstacles, emotional, mental, or otherwise, that kind of make it hard that are difficult to overcome, that allow us to kind of fall into those reductions, and how we can get into an integrated relationship with God. So I've just talked for a long time now, but I want to hear your thoughts. Where would you like to go? Because we both might have the gift of gab.
Yeah. So let's just start with your first category, which is judgment. And basically what I was trying to say on the most recent podcast episode on judgment is that as Christians, many of us have this sense that I shouldn't judge my parents. And so when somebody like me, a counselor, invites somebody to look at their story, to look at some of the ways that they've been harmed by their parents, what often pops up for Christians is, I shouldn't go there. Like, who am I to judge my parents? It's just not my place. It's not right. That's for God. And all I want to say is, if you read what Jesus says about judgment in Matthew 7, which begins with those famous words, do not judge or you too will be judged. If you keep reading, his whole point is that you actually, as a follower of Christ, are called to judge. You can't take the speck out of someone's eye until you've named that they have a speck there and that it needs to be removed. And so I just don't want people to get hung up on, I shouldn't judge my parents, and that becomes the reason that they don't look at the past. Because the past matters. It is profoundly affecting not only your relationship with others, but your relationship with God.
Yeah.
The ways that you have been harmed in the past, which includes your parents, not only your parents, but our parents have a profound influence on our brains, on our hearts.
Yeah.
And the ways that we've been harmed have a profound influence on how we interact with Jesus and how we understand God.
Yeah, I was having this conversation with my sister after listening to the podcast, because for me, it was like, finally, I get to judge, and it's not that, the thing is, we're all judging anyway, right?
Yep.
So, let's stop pretending like that isn't happening. But I think, it wasn't so much that listening to your podcast gave me that, as it gave me, the framework by which to understand it better. Because certainly we're called to judge good and evil. Certainly as a Christian, I'm making a judgment. My life is better with Christ than without. Like, this is the ongoing thing. But then actually, like, if we're going to be real friends to each other, that does mean that in the first place, I have to confront my past, my family of origin, whatever trauma is there. Because there's no way we can get to the business of actually serving and being friends with each other in a real Christian way if that part doesn't happen. And I feel like we skip to superficial friendship, which is maybe why we're so lonely and dissatisfied. I don't know. But
Yes.
because of this refusal and to look at the past. And something I really appreciate about Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, is that this is in a homily he gave in the 60s, where he said that when we censor out the facts, like God can't handle it. If we censor the facts, that's actually not faith. It's a refusal of faith. It's a form of skepticism. Mm-hmm. And I felt like when I was listening to your podcast, that's what was happening there. It was like, yes, like, what is it that we're so afraid of? Do we not have enough faith to go to the darker places?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And when it comes to interacting in a real way with Jesus Christ, you can either bring your full heart or you can edit. Right. And most of us edit. We edit with God, we edit with others. We withhold things that we know are there. Most of us have some anger at God, or at least questions.
Yeah.
And we don't often feel the freedom to bring those questions or to bring that anger to God. And all I want to say is, why? I mean, if you read your scriptures, people are bringing anger to God all the time.
All the time.
All the time.
What are you doing to me?
And so there's something going on in this particular cultural moment mm-hmm. that makes many Christians feel like, I can't bring that to God in prayer. It's not fit for the sovereignty of God. And all I want to say is, you can either be authentic and real with God, or you can avoid your own self, which is really avoiding God.
Yes, I find that if I'm talking to somebody, or even talking to family members, and bringing up this idea of like, well, have you voiced your irritation to our Lord? What I get is a lot of intellectualizing. So lots of like, well, he's merciful, he's good. Yes, I agree. He's always working out things for our good, for those love. Yes, I agree. But what does that have to do with, like you said, being real? How do we, for our women who are listening, who maybe are struggling with the, it's not proper, especially since, and I mentioned this in the last podcast, 50% of Catholics, I think, don't actually believe a personal relationship with Jesus is possible.
Right.
So, and I don't think that that's our women, but this is our church. Like, this is our problem. And so how do we start to transform the culture in ourselves through our presence, or through doing this? I mean, of course, doing the work, but do you have any advice about that? How do we continue to encourage that and make it okay, in a sense?
Confession. In other words, confessing to one another what's happening in our own hearts and in our relationship with God. And so, it's not for everyone, but hopefully you have a couple of friends that you have enough safety with that you can vulnerably say, I have been lamenting this for years, and I have finally found the courage to bring that lament to God in prayer. And here's what that's been like for me. And now the person is walking with you in the drama of your story, because that's going to unfold. And if your friend has courage, your friend is going to ask you a couple weeks later, how's that going for you?
Yeah.
How is God engaging you back on your lament? Do you hear silence? Do you hear words? What's happening for you?
What's happening?
And now you're having a relationship at a very different level with your friend, because you have given your friend access to your spiritual life in a way that she didn't have before, because you've told her that you're frustrated with God and that you're talking to God about it.
Yeah. Do you think those friends are hard to find?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a loaded question. I wasn't sure what you would say, but one of the things that has really come out for me during quarantine, social distancing, is that is the way I have seen people shift in being able to engage the experience now. So, for example, yes, this closing the conversation of nothing to complain about, God is good, da da da, which again, I do not disagree with that. However, like, what's really going on?
Right.
And the conversation being closed. And so if we don't have those people to talk about them with, or it's not permissive or permitted, that's even more isolating than social distancing.
Absolutely.
So I hope for women who are listening, who are struggling with this, to give you permission, maybe in the encounter of this podcast, of, it is okay to decide to stop editing your experience. I just talked to a priest friend of mine who's very close to God, who was just, talking about how he had a nice little fist fight with Jesus. And I've never heard that before. Maybe it's a masculine thing too, but I thought, wait, can we stop? Can we talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah.
I'm sure, I don't know. But that was provocative to me, because it was an indication something real is happening for him.
Right. And it is provocative, but there's a sense in which it shouldn't be. I mean, the church is an extension of Israel. Israel's name is struggles with God. And it's really a struggle that is more accurately termed a wrestling with God. And wrestling is very close to fist fighting. And so Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord. There's something in the Psalms of people wrestling with God through nights of prayer that involves couches getting drenched with tears. I mean, this is not academic theology. This is a very in the dirt,
right,
bringing your real heart to a real God, and in a sense, asking the questions of your heart to a heavenly Father. And the question always is, will he father you? Will you father me even in this? Or am I fundamentally an orphan?
Yeah. Pope Francis talks about existential orphans. And I often wonder if he's, I mean, I think it's safe to say he's talking about Christians. He's talking about us.
Yeah.
And that is real. And when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith? I mean, if it's not about this, like if the censorship, like if his own family is censoring him out, like.
Yeah, but do you know what you're quoting there? You're quoting the very end of what's called the parable of the persistent widow.
Oh, right.
And 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 Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes, will he, the best translation there is, will he find this kind of faith on earth? The
Oh,
Greek is referring to the kind of faith of the persistent widow.
that,
Now,
yeah.
what kind of faith does the persistent widow have? She goes to an unjust judge and says, my adversary has harmed me and I demand justice. And the judge is annoyed. But the judge says, I will grant you justice because you keep persisting in coming to me to demand it. And Jesus says, will you have that kind of faith? I mean, he is provoking us to provoke him. He's provoking us to bring our beef to God in prayer.
Why is he doing that? I have my theories, but why? Why do you think?
In my mind, it's because he knows that it's so human to avoid an honest reckoning with God. It's so human to hide.
To hide.
Go back to Genesis 3. It's just so human to hide our real hearts and our real desires and our real anger and our real doubts from God. And Jesus is all the time, I think, subtly and not so subtly, asking us, will you bring your heart to me? Because, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it's fascinating that Jesus says, many will say to me on that day, hey, didn't we drive out demons in your name, perform many miracles? And I will say to them, get away from me. I never knew you. Now, we think he's going to say, you never knew me.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? We think the theology test is, look, you don't know Jesus. Therefore, you're out. It's not what he says.
Yeah.
It's stunning. This will upend bookshelves of theology. Because what Jesus says is, I never knew you. Now, what could he mean by that? He knows everybody. He knows my heart up and down, inside out. What does he mean there? What he's saying is, you have not brought your heart to me.
Right.
You have not let me in to the corners of your heart.
Yeah.
And you might be driving out demons, performing miracles, but if you have not let me in to the core wars of your heart, to what really makes Adam, Adam, then I don't know you.
Right. I think that's the part that freaks me out, because especially being in ministry, and for many of our women who are and might be in ministry, I mean, you can do all sorts of great things for the Lord, right? But
Yep.
that's not the same. And he even allows that, like, we exercise our charisms. That doesn't even mean we're saved, and certainly doesn't mean we're happy, like in an eternal way. So that freaks me out a lot, because it's like, you could look at the fruitfulness that maybe God is bringing out of your life, but that still doesn't, that they're still you, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing that you don't want to mess up, So
Right. And it's a simple thing. It's as simple as, who are you? And will you bring your desires and your disappointments to God in prayer, which is to say, dialogue.
right. I think one of the things that I think is so dangerous, that I don't encounter it as much, but I do a little bit in the Catholic world, is this whole, like, you can't trust your desires. You can't trust, like, just all, if it doesn't hurt, it's not from God. You can't, you can't trust your desires. And I was thinking, actually, the desires, those are whatever impure, bad desires underneath it all, when you clear it out, are good desires. And I think we don't want to do the work of clearing it out, or like too afraid. And so we've got to look at the desires, because God operates in our desires. So we can't be afraid of ourselves. I mean, we've got to just go to the depths. live intensely, but wow. Well, okay, so what about with anxiety? What do we do with that? How do we get over that? Or can
The question with anxiety is, what are you anxious about? And people are anxious about different things. Your anxieties will give you clues to what you worship.
Oh, that's very good. Your anxieties will give you clues as to what you worship.
So
Wow.
if I'm only anxious when the things that are closest to my heart are threatened.
Mm.
And so your anxieties can be great clues to your story.
Yeah.
They can be like a roadmap to understanding how your brain has been shaped, which is to say how your heart has been shaped. So you don't need to hate your anxieties. Can you welcome them like a guest at the table in
Mm.
like an Old Testament hospitality sense, which means that you are focused on providing a banquet of welcome to the guest. What if you welcomed your anxiety about finances as a guest?
Oh, wow.
What
Right.
if you welcomed your anxiety about your 13-year-old son who's not doing well and you're anxious? What if you welcomed that anxiety as a guest? What does it tell you about your heart? It
Mm.
will give you clues to your story. And so anxiety it's pointless to talk about in the abstract.
Right.
Nobody's anxious in the abstract. You're anxious about certain things, and those things are different for me than they are for you. And
Right.
those things will give you clues to where you've been wounded in the
Yeah.
past. And
Wow.
so I often come back to Isaiah 61, where, it's Jesus quotes at the starting gate of his ministry in Luke 4. And Isaiah 61 is simply making a link between the way our heart has been broken
Mm.
and what we come to worship, what we come to look to as idols. And we can make an idol out of anything.
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 I'm thinking of one example in my own life. I won't mention, but it's the stupidest thing ever. And God took it away. It was the stupidest thing ever. So banal. But I really like that, because I think it's what you're, to me, the way I'm translating what you're saying is that in the interest of not editing and not censoring, if we welcome the anxiety as a guest, but really it's an act of faith to say that I can use this idolatry or whatever as an opportunity to dialogue, and ultimately hopefully
Yeah.
an opportunity to root myself into that which is not an idol. That's
Yes.
superb.
Yeah, and God is not surprised by our idolatries. Like, God is not ashamed of them even,
Yeah.
but he wants us to put language to them so that we might be set free. I mean, the Spirit of God is about setting human beings free. And anxiety is places where we're bound. We're not free. It's an awful feeling.
It
We're
is.
bound by something. It always goes back to wounding.
Yeah, wow. There's so many different thoughts going through my mind. I haven't gotten through a lot of I recall on your podcast about like agreements we've made, and right, and the ones I have listened to were just on point. But it seems to me you're touching on this right now with the anxiety, and that we're bound by something. We want to be liberated. So the first step is then to go to the depths again, going to the depths of the anxiety and saying, okay, how can this be not a negative thing, but a positive thing as a step forward towards the path of freedom.
Yes.
Um, wow. How did you, Adam, get into all, I'd love to know a little bit about your own story,
Yeah.
and how that happened, how this became your personal vocation, which at least my own little limited circle has been already so transformative and healing for us.
How did I get into therapy, being a
Yeah. How
therapist?
did you get into, yes. Oh,
Well, there's two ways of answering that. There's kind of the surface way, which I won't bore you with, but the real reason I got into therapy is because of my mother. My my mother looked to me to meet her emotional needs because her husband, my father, was checked out.
Yeah.
And so I'm a 4-year-old boy, a 6-year-old boy, an 8-year-old boy, and she is subtly and not so subtly training me to be very attuned to her because her husband is a Vietnam vet, is checked out emotionally, is not in any way engaged with her. And I'm her firstborn.
Right.
So she trains me to be very attuned to her emotional shifts so that I can tend to her and bring her some regulation to her dysregulated, freaked out, panicked body.
Yeah.
And that's an awful thing to do to a son. It's called covert sexual abuse, but it creates oftentimes in that boy the ability to read the heart of a woman,
Yeah.
to read the heart of a man,
Right.
to read what's happening in a room between a husband and a wife. I knew how to read that when I was 8.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's both wow and it's like, oh my gosh, the grief.
That's
Because
what
no,
that was motivating my wow, because an
yeah,
8-year-old, you should like, that's not at all what should be
absolutely.
in your psyche, in your mind. I mean, at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, wow.
And for your listeners, uh, just to put a few more words to this, whenever there is not a deep commitment of love between a husband and a wife, whenever there is not an ongoing repentance between a husband and a wife, where they're owning the ways they harm each other, they're
Yeah.
repairing,
Yeah.
right? When that's lacking, either the father or the mother often look to one of the children to get their needs met. Because people will get their emotional needs met.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
that results in what's called triangulation. In other words, picture a triangle between you, your mother, and your father. And at some point in everyone's life, you need to draw your triangle. Every one of your listeners, I mean, they need to get a sticky note and draw their triangle. And on that triangle needs to be themselves, their mother, and their father. And the closeness of the sides represents the closeness of the relationship. So a healthy triangle is an isosceles triangle, if you remember geometry, where mom and dad are at the top, they are closest to each other, and then the child is at the bottom. And the distance from the child is further than the distance between mom and dad. Sadly, for so many people, certainly people with trauma, their triangle did not look like that. They were closer to their mother or their father than mom and dad were to each other. That results in absolute havoc and chaos inside the heart of a child and all sorts of dynamics between the siblings. And it results in what's properly called developmental trauma.
Yeah. Would you say that, I mean, this seems to be the heart of the problem right here. I mean, the family of origin, the parental relationship. And I'm just thinking about our, like like our culture today, which so many broken families, and then the ones that are together, so much of all of this that you're talking about. What do we do? Because not everybody can go to therapy, or not everybody, there, I know this is like Jesus' problem, not ours, but
Well,
sometimes it can just seem overwhelming.
yeah, absolutely.
So,
The words of Jesus are that the truth will set you free. And so the first step is, are you willing to be truthful about your story? Are you willing to put language to what it was like for you in your family of origin? What was your relationship with your mother like? What was your relationship with your father like? What was their relationship like as husband and wife? And if you're willing to start there, then are you willing to name how sibling rivalries ensued as a result?
oh, that's such an interesting element. I've never even thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And we, again, the stories are the formative stories of our faith. So Jacob and Esau are not, that story is not primarily about Jacob and Esau.
Uh,
It's about the division between Isaac and Rebekah. and how Rebecca looked to Jacob.
Oh goodness. Wow.
And read the narrative again, and you'll see where Rebecca and Jacob are, I'm putting my fingers together, are like this.
Right.
And Isaac and Esau are tight.
Right.
And there is a closeness between Jacob and Rebecca that does not exist between Isaac and Rebecca. And you know the rest of the story.
Yep.
I mean, absolute chaos and contempt and alienation results.
It's interesting, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about Dr. Janet Smith, who's one of my heroes and writes a lot about marriage and all this kind of stuff. And something she told me recently was that we think that the job of parents is to raise their children. In fact, children are the ones that are there to mature their parents. And so if you have parents who are immature, they have, in a way, missed the chance that their children could have provided them to become mature, whole adults.
Yeah, I mean, I have a choice every day. I have a daughter and a son, and I can either lean into the complexity and the difficulties of loving my wife and talking with her and engaging honestly with her, or I can take all of that to my daughter.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many people had to suffer the weight of a father who, they're the daughter, and the father was actually looking to that daughter to meet a lot of his needs because he was not willing to engage his wife.
Right.
And so many of your listeners have to put language to what was the nature of my relationship with my father. And here's the added complexity. When dad and daughter are closer than dad and wife, dad and mom.
Yeah.
Mom begins to envy daughter.
Yeah. Right.
And how many daughters have difficult relationships with their mothers? So many.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And very often it is rooted in triangulation from years ago.
And we just,
it's not,
yeah, right.
It's not the thing that happened at Thanksgiving last year.
The thing is never about the thing.
The thing is never really about the thing. It's about the fact that mom was not too fond of the fact that dad would go to every one of your softball games and had eyes for you and never took her out to dinner and never brought her flowers and didn't have eyes for her.
What do you say to people in the church or women or whatnot who are like, that this is just so lofty, this is just being spoiled, this is just, you're indulgent, you're thinking too much, let's just move on, life is short, and let's just continue on what I guess now I would call the editing path. What do we, is it worth a conversation? Or, I don't know. I tend to, not so much in my generation, but I think there's a certain generation where, therapy, mental health, emotional healing, this is all just made up or unnecessary.
Yeah. And what I would say is Jeremiah 6:8, where God says rather angrily to the leaders of Israel, they dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
God is very committed to tending to real wounds.
Yes.
We are not so interested in naming the existence of those wounds, and certainly naming that they still affect us 30 years later.
Yeah.
But God says they dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. And that goes back to the anxiety. There is no peace in our bodies. We're anxious, we're depressed, we have addictions, we have compulsions. We explode in anger at our son, 13-year-old son, and we don't even know why. and we can't bear to go back and repair it with him. And we don't even know why we can't do that. Our bodies are not at peace.
Yes.
And Jesus is saying, you're wounded.
Yeah.
And I am very interested in dressing that wound as though it were as serious as it is.
You know, it's so interesting you're saying all this, and especially with the body element, because and maybe I'm just, I don't know, right or wrong, but I'm becoming more and more convicted as I continue to learn and grow in these things, that so much of our bodily health issues are really emotional issues, and I'm kind of afraid to say that out loud, turning into one of those crunchy Catholics, but I'm starting to really believe that. I mean,
yeah,
what can I say about that?
Well, all I would say to this is that God created us as very holistic beings, and the mind and the soul and the body and the spirit are inseparably linked.
Yeah.
And we know this just from, Paul's body illustrations in the New Testament. When the toe is hurting, the whole body suffers. If you have a broken toe, it affects your entire day and everything you do with your body.
Right.
And so when your heart, which is to say your right limbic brain, to speak of it, neurobiologically, when your right limbic brain is wounded, that can't help but influence your digestive system, because the body is linked up. It can't help but influence your immune system. It can't help but affect your cardiovascular system. And so when people have stomach problems, very often it is related to their emotional wounding.
I believe that 100,000%. I really do. The older I get, the more and more and more I believe that, especially because there's such a huge prevalence of stomach issues and gut issues and all. And it has to, it's gotta be anxiety related. It's gotta, there's no, it seems like a no-brainer these days with the amount of gut health. But okay, so then answer me this. As I was reflecting on all this stuff, in my world, it's theology. I used to teach moral theology. Here are the sins, here are the vices. As I kind of get older, and I'm looking at all the kind of the complexity of it all. I just was looking at the crucifix one afternoon, thinking, I don't want to explain away all of my sins with therapy language, but there came a point where I thought, there's a lot of woundedness in the world, and there's a lot of woundedness in me. And then Jesus' words on the cross, forgive them, they know not what they do, kind of came to me as a consolation, where a lot of times we are acting out of that brokenness and not because we're just these malicious creatures, So is there a category, or in your mind, is there a way that you kind of grapple with those two realities, that we are at the same time free and sinful, but also broken? And oftentimes, like you were saying, you don't know why, you just kind of lash out at your 13-year-old son, but you do. How have you maybe it's not a question to be resolved, it's grace and freedom and all that, but is there a way you have resolved that, or in some way grappled with that? I think I'd love to hear from you about that.
Yeah, here's how I understand it. Our idolatry, our sin, grows in the soil of our pain. And so my sinfulness is going to be different in character than yours. Where I do harm to people in the world, where I have idolatry, it's going to be different than yours. It's not random.
Yeah.
Okay, so it grows out of, i.e., it is very linked to the ways you have been wounded. It's linked to your brokenness. Right. So these are not either or concepts. They're both and. Like, you're wounded by the sin of others, and you respond to that very often, tragically, in sinful ways to try and protect yourself from that ever happening again. And we can go into for specifics, there's really no way to talk about this meaningfully apart from particularity, which is apart from people's actual stories. A great example is sexual addiction, porn addiction. Nobody looks at pornography. You look at particular kinds of pornography.
Interesting. Right. Right.
And the question is, have you ever been curious about why you type what you type into this Google search bar? Because what arouses you is different than what arouses someone else. Aren't you curious about why? Trust me, it is related to your story. It's not random.
It's not random. It's
right.
not random. And your healing won't be random either.
Right.
Yeah. It's just, there's.
Right. Because Jesus is very committed to interacting with you and tailoring his interaction with you to you in your language, your particularity. I mean, in the Gospels, he's always so personal with people. He's always treating different people differently. And he does the same with us. He's going to interact with me differently than with you. Yeah. And he's going to interact with us in the areas of our desire and our disappointment. Because those are the things that drive human beings, desire and disappointment.
Desire and disappointment. Yes. Woo. And that's I gotta keep that relationship alive, because there's a lot of those things. I had a friend the other day that text messaged me and said, I'm just gonna stop asking God for specific things because I'm just gonna pray for his will, whatever he wants, and all this kind of stuff. And I just thought, oh gosh, I don't even know where to begin here, because managing expectation, managing desire is just like a horrible way to live.
Yeah, but I get it. I get it,
right?
I get your friend.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because I can't bear the agony of hope.
Right. Don't you have to be healed a certain level to even start to begin to work on traumas, to start to begin to, what if you're encountering someone who they can't even go there. Like even listening to this podcast could be triggering. I mean, yes. How do we do that? How do we help each other in this way when it gets to high level stuff like that?
Attunement. So your greatest gift to another human being is to be attuned to what's happening inside of them. In other words, people are at different places all the time. And someone might not be able to bear engaging what it was like for them in 8th grade. And so I would not want to take them there, but I will be with them where they are. And where they are is something embodied. They're having an experience in their bodies. So they're listening to the podcast. Oh, okay, what moved you? What dysregulated you?
And begin there.
And start there. And we need not go any further than simply noticing which sentence that Adam or Simone said really affected my insides. And let's just be curious together about why. Why might that be? It will lead you into healing.
Gosh, the curiosity too. I mean, this is my struggle. I will, especially being a theology type person, want to have those clean answers. But you know that, I don't know if you do this in your world, but in my world, sometimes we do the word of the year. Like we'll have a saint of the year.
Yeah.
The word, and my word of this year was curious, which is so funny because of course I always want to have the answer right away and quickly, and to just allow myself to just live and wonder and to be provoked and to have that invitation, that welcome that guest and be, I mean, it's been really a year of growth, especially with all these surprising circumstances, but also, gosh, that's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Croatian theologian at Yale, Miroslav Volf, who says that Christianity is the difference between I hold and I am held. And you, in your younger years, Simone, you wanted to hold. Absolutely. You wanted to understand. You wanted to contain. You wanted to have matrices that explained.
Yes. Yep.
And far more for you now, you are learning what it is to be held.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly. But that is our faith.
That's our faith.
Our faith, like sorry, Saint Gregory of Nyssa says to be a Christian, not to seem to be a Christian,
Right.
but to be is so much more than to do stuff, and that is just requires a whole other level of intensity that I think we can avoid with all the projects. So
Yes, indeed. But it also invites us into a playful encounter with God,
yes,
rather than a serious and sterile,
yes,
engagement with
I
God.
love that.
Like
I love that. I love that.
Jesus is very playful, and that alone is provocative.
And leaves
Even,
the question open,
yeah,
and just loves to leave the question open. I love that. I have to say, my Middle Eastern background, I'm grateful because the flavor that the faith took in the Middle East is very playful. Sometimes it's so playful that you get into all the jokes and never the serious stuff. But I have to say I'm grateful for that as part of my story, because I remember, even you'll crack up at this. I told my mother, I said something, and this is when I was first learning all these kind of therapeutic words like codependency. I was so excited to start testing them out, and I said, Mother, that was so codependent of you, and she just, without a second, I mean, the woman's so funny, goes, Jesus and Mary were codependent. He didn't want to turn the water into wine, but he did. Huh?
wow.
I know. I know, Mom, you are so, and she knows she's being naughty, but like, oh my gosh, that is.
Her response was so quick, Simone.
So quick. It was just
Right.
so quick.
Yeah. That's a formidable woman.
She is. She definitely is. Things that, yeah, it just, I mean, that is, but I think this is something that is like you were saying, the mother daughters, and in the Endow community, this is a Catholic women's community. So these are the things I think we can really turbocharge our faith and our spiritual life by going to these depths. And I'm grateful to you for this conversation, to accompany us and to help us. So
yes.
Thank you so much. Anything else that you think would be worth mentioning, that could be of a help?
I mean, I could talk for hours about these subjects, but I think what I really want to invite people into is to look at their story and to consider the possibility that their past is affecting their present relationship with others and relationship with God. And to believe, or at least flirt with the possibility that God might want to accompany you into your story, so that you can see how God is co-authoring a good story out of your life. And good stories are complex and filled with conflict and filled with heartache and filled with redemption. Nobody wants a boring story.
Yes.
But nobody wants a story that has trauma in it either. And the trajectory of all story work is Genesis 50:20, which is, you will one day come to say, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And when you're able to say that, you know God in a way that nobody can take God away from you. No theological argument, no book, no cynicism, because you've experienced the goodness of God in the land of the living.
That's the better part. That's the better part. Oh, I love that. Wow. And that I think, if I could just like close us off with this, I think that is we spend, I think, so much time on a superficial level that I don't want us as church and as community to miss that better part, because life is short. We are fragile. Like, this is all contingent, and this is the part we don't want to miss. And I think we spend so much time especially in a very moralistic understanding and experience of the church, of Christ, of just like this, ongoing failure at moral coherency. And like, really, like, can we get beyond that into the good stuff, into the story? Like, can we please?
Yeah.
I'm ready for that. I'm ready for that in my own life. I'm ready for that in the lives of those that I'm on this journey with. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome, Simone. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Pleasure here. And I look forward to all the women who are going to listen to your podcast or this. I know they are, and they're going to say, oh my gosh. So thank you.
You're welcome.